Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine you're trying to steer a big ship, maybe a business, an organization, or, even just getting a new idea off the ground. You know where you want to go, but it feels like there are these currents pushing you forward and others, well, pulling you back. That push and pull. It's really the core of something called force field analysis.
Yeah, and it's a fantastic tool developed by psychologist Kurt Lewin, and it's what our sources are looking at today. Think of it genuinely like a tug of war.
Hmm.
Seriously,
Yeah.
on one side, you've got forces championing the change, and on the other side, forces digging their heels in, resisting it.
Exactly. And our mission here in this deep dive is basically to give you the shortcut to understanding this model, how it helps you actually see those competing forces, and crucially, why getting a handle on them is so important when you're trying to make anything happen. It's really about understanding the dynamics of change so you can hopefully influence them.
Right. At its heart, Lewin's concept is that any situation, any proposed change, is sitting in a kind of equilibrium. It's held in place by these two sets of forces acting against each other.
Right. He calls them driving forces. Those are the ones actively supporting, initiating, or encouraging the change you want to see. They help you get closer to your goal.
And then you have the restraining forces. These are the counterparts, the ones working against the change. They create that resistance you feel, actively hindering you from, well, achieving the goal.
That tug of war analogy from the material is just perfect, isn't it? It immediately gives you that visual.
It really does. Forces pulling in opposite directions. And it highlights why change is often so difficult. It's rarely just a simple case of deciding to do something and then, doing it. You're working against existing dynamics.
So if you're in that tug of war, the source material makes it pretty clear. Effective change, real change, only happens when the collective strength, the weight of those driving forces, becomes stronger than the restraining forces pulling back.
Precisely. If the forces are balanced, in equilibrium, or maybe even worse, if the restraining forces are stronger, well, that desired change is probably not going to happen.
Stuck in the mud, basically.
Right. So the path to actually achieving change means you have to find a way to either boost the strength of your driving forces or weaken the restraining ones, or, ideally, figure out how to do both.
And this isn't just like abstract theory to think about. The sources lay out a pretty practical process for actually doing a force field analysis. It's a way to systematically identify and analyze these forces in your specific situation.
Right. It starts quite simply. Step one, identify all the forces you can think of, everything that's either pushing for or resisting the specific change you're looking at.
And the source gives some great examples here, things you'll probably recognize from your own experience, right? For driving forces, you might see things like supportive managers, maybe pressure from competitors is pushing you,
Yep.
new technology that enables something, or perhaps the changes in legislation that force your hand.
Uh-huh. And then on the restraining side, you could have things like maybe pushback from customers or existing legislation holding you back. Challenges with adopting new technology, missed opportunities in other areas, distracting resources. Financial considerations cost is almost always a factor.
Yeah.
Employee resistance, that's a huge one. Time constraints too. And interestingly, even managers can be restraining forces.
Wait a second. Managers are on both lists. And legislation. Technology changes. How can the same thing be pushing for and resisting change?
Yeah, that's where the analysis gets really insightful, I think. It forces you to look closer, be more specific. Is it all managers resisting or maybe just one specific group? Is existing legislation a barrier while some proposed new legislation is actually a driver?
Mhm.
It really highlights the complexity and the subjectivity involved. A force might be driving for one stakeholder but restraining for another. Depends on their perspective, how the change impacts them.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not just the label like technology, but the specific impact and how people perceive that impact.
Exactly. So once you've brainstormed all these potential forces driving, restraining the next step in the process is to try and gauge their strength. You give each one a numerical score, a weighting. The sources suggest a simple scale, maybe 1 for weak, up to 5 for strong, just to represent how much influence you think that force actually has.
So you're quantifying the tug of war a little bit, trying to
Yeah.
get a sense of the balance, and that leads you to prioritize, right? Step two is basically identifying the top, say, 3 to 5 most significant forces on each side, the ones with the highest scores, because those are the key players, the ones you really need to focus your energy on.
Then you move into step 3, developing an action plan. And this is where a visual aid, like that tease diagram mentioned in the source, can be really helpful. You list the driving forces on one side, restraining on the other, maybe jot down those scores next to them.
Right, so you can see it all laid out. And this is where the analysis becomes truly actionable, isn't it? You look at those key forces, the big ones, and brainstorm specific actions you can actually take. Who needs to do what? What resources are needed?
And those actions are laser focused. They're designed specifically to either, well, pump up the strength of those key driving forces, or, and this can be really powerful, to eliminate or at least reduce the influence of the key restraining forces.
Yeah, because sometimes weakening the resistance is easier or maybe more impactful than just pushing harder on the accelerator.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And finally, the process isn't quite complete once you launch the plan. Step 4 is really important. Review and evaluate the response. You need to see if your actions actually had the intended impact. Is the balance of forces actually shifting? Are you making progress?
It's that feedback loop, this whole systematic approach. I mean, you can see why people use force field analysis. It gives you a much clearer picture, almost like an X-ray of the change situation.
Definitely. It lets you weigh the factors for and against a particular change in a structured way. It helps you decide if it's even, viable right now or what needs to happen to make it viable.
And it doesn't just show you the forces, it points you towards action. It helps identify which driving forces you should maybe lean into more, amplify, and exactly which pockets of resistance you need to actively address.
Plus, another benefit, especially if you involve different people in doing the analysis,
Yeah.
it naturally helps various stakeholders see the change from different angles,
Mm.
positive or negative from their point of view. It can really highlight where there's misalignment or misunderstanding.
That transparency piece, it can act as a powerful communication tool in itself, can it? Just having everyone looking at the same force field diagram, talking about the same forces, can reduce barriers.
It really can. And on a very practical level, it helps with things like developing more realistic timelines, figuring out exactly what resources you'll actually need. And it can even shine a light on hidden gaps. Maybe a key restraining force is a lack of a specific skill in the team. That points you directly to a training need, for instance. Or maybe an inadequate system needs redesign.
And crucially, it helps you identify who within the organization might be a champion for this change, and who might be an obstacle you need to work with or persuade.
However,
Hmm.
like any model, force field analysis isn't, a perfect crystal ball. It's not foolproof. The sources are good at pointing out some real-world limitations.
Right. Like sometimes you might just miss a force entirely when you're doing the initial analysis. Or maybe new ones just pop up unexpectedly later on as the situation changes. Things evolve.
For sure. And that numerical weighting we talked about, giving a score from 1 to 5, well, that's inherently subjective, isn't it? What feels like a 5 level of resistance to one person might honestly feel like a 3 foot to someone else, depending on their viewpoint or their direct experience.
Yeah.
That subjectivity can really bias the results.
Yeah, totally. It's based on perception, which isn't always the same as objective reality if that even exists in these situations. And the timelines you develop based on the analysis, those can also be subjective and, let's face it, get completely derailed by unforeseen events. Stuff happens.
Mhm. And even when you assign responsibility for specific actions based on your analysis, you might discover later that the person needs more training or support than you initially thought. That can cause unexpected delays.
Okay, so wrapping this up, what does this all mean? We've taken a deep dive into Kurt Lewin's force field analysis. It's a simple yet pretty powerful model, helping you visualize and understand the dynamics of change as this push and pull between driving and restraining forces.
We saw how identifying these forces, giving them some kind of weight, prioritizing the really impactful ones,
Yeah.
and then creating a targeted action plan to shift that balance. That's the key to actually making change happen, or at least increasing the odds.
And then we looked at the practical benefits, things like gaining clarity, identifying concrete actions, improving communication, but also acknowledged those crucial limitations, particularly around subjectivity and the fact that these forces aren't static. They can change.
Understanding this framework gives you a really valuable lens, I think, a way to look at any situation where change is involved. And it helps you figure out why things might be flowing smoothly, or maybe why you're hitting unexpected friction or resistance.
So here's where it gets really interesting, thinking about those limitations. Given that scoring those forces is so subjective, really based on individual perception, and that new forces can always emerge, or existing ones can shift in importance, this raises a pretty big question for you to think about. If the analysis, the map you create, is based on a snapshot in time and heavily influenced by subjective views, How might you keep your force field analysis alive and truly useful as the change process actually unfolds and the landscape inevitably shifts around you?